We've all imagined what it would be like to live in a zombie apocalypse. And you know what? It's just such an interesting topic to think and talk about. So I have decided to list every single thing you haven't considered about zombie apocalypses, starting with the fact that nature would actually be on your side. Zombie decomposition. Zombies can't maintain tissue integrity without blood circulation or cellular repair. Maggots colonize every orifice, consuming soft tissue at rates that would strip a body to bones in under 2 months under ideal conditions for insects. Winter freezing might preserve them temporarily, but spring thaw accelerates decay exponentially. Rain washes away structural proteins, wind scatters dried flesh, and UV radiation breaks down skin cells like paper left in sunlight. 28 days later actually acknowledges this reality when the infected starve to death after exhausting their metabolic reserves. The rage virus keeps them alive just long enough to spread, then biology takes over and they collapse from organ failure. World War Z hints at it when frozen zombies shatter in cold climates, their tissues too crystallized to function. But most films ignore how fast bodies fall apart, because showing skeletal remains shuffling around looks ridiculous on screen. The Walking Dead stretches this to absurd lengths, with walkers persisting for years despite having no muscle tissue left to move limbs. Return of the Living Dead introduced the idea of indestructible zombies that don't decay, which makes for better horror but worse science. The reality is harsh and quick. Flies lay eggs within hours of death, beetle larvae tunnel through dermis layers, and fungal spores colonize damp flesh like a petri dish. Within 60 days, you're looking at scattered bones and stained concrete, not a shuffling horde. But that raises a question nobody asks. If zombies decompose in months, why do movies show them lasting years? Keep that in mind, because the answer involves something hunting them, and it's not human. Wildlife predation. Zombies are meat, and predators don't distinguish between walking corpses and roadkill. Coyotes, wolves, bears, wild dogs, and even smaller scavengers like raccoons will feast on slow-moving targets that can't effectively fight back. A pack of feral dogs can strip a zombie to bones in hours, and unlike human survivors, animals don't get infected by eating undead flesh because cross-species transmission requires specific viral adaptations. Birds pick at exposed tissue, carrying off fingers and eyeballs to feed their young. Rats burrow into abdominal cavities, nesting in rib cages like macabre condos. Resident Evil briefly shows zombie dogs, but those are infected animals, not natural predators cleaning up the mess. Army of the Dead includes a zombie tiger, which raises questions about why more films don't explore infected wildlife, but even that ignores how regular animals would simply eat zombies like any other carrion. Warm Bodies skips this entirely, keeping its undead remarkably intact despite years of wandering around exposed to elements and opportunistic feeders. The Girl with All the Gifts shows fungal zombies standing motionless in fields, but never addresses how deer wouldn't just graze around them while birds nest in their hair. National Geographic documented how quickly scavengers locate dead animals in wilderness areas, sometimes within minutes of death. Vultures circle, insects swarm, and within days, the carcass is gone. Zombies shuffling through forests or prairies become mobile buffets for every creature with teeth or a beak. The food chain doesn't stop for the apocalypse. It accelerates. Here's where it gets strange, though. Animals eating zombies solves one problem, but creates another that's way worse. And 3 movies accidentally showed this without realizing what they were depicting. The question is, what happens when nature doesn't just eat the zombies, but replaces them? Environmental overgrowth. Without maintenance, urban areas become forests in 5 to 10 years. Tree roots crack through asphalt, vines strangle traffic lights, and buildings collapse under the weight of accumulated plant matter and water damage. Zombies can't navigate dense undergrowth or climb over fallen trees, so nature creates natural barriers that trap the undead in increasingly small pockets. Flooding from clogged drainage systems turns streets into rivers, sweeping away anything not anchored down, including waterlogged corpses that float downstream to decompose in stagnant pools. I Am Legend shows this beautifully, with grass growing through Manhattan streets and trees breaking through apartment windows, but the film focuses on Will Smith's isolation rather than exploring how this environmental shift fundamentally changes survival dynamics. Overgrowth means fresh water sources from natural springs, edible plants colonizing gardens and parks, and small game populations exploding without human predation. Dawn of the Dead keeps its mall pristine despite months of abandonment, which is absurd. Real buildings develop mold, leak when roofs fail, and become structurally unsound as weather penetrates the envelope. Zombieland treats abandoned cities like theme parks, frozen in time, when reality would show nature violently reclaiming every square inch. Train to Busan takes place almost entirely on a moving train, avoiding the question altogether. Plant growth Overgrowth doesn't just hide zombies, it immobilizes them. A walker stuck in thorny brambles or sucked into mud isn't a threat. A horde trapped behind a river they can't cross becomes a non-issue. The apocalypse ends when the world becomes too wild for the undead to navigate, but overgrowth hides something movies never show, something microscopic that kills faster than any zombie ever could. One study suggests this invisible threat would wipe out 60% of survivors before they even encountered the undead. What is it? Hold that thought, because first, you need to understand why walls and guns won't save you. Disease vectors. Sanitation collapses immediately during apocalypses, and human waste piles up faster than anyone can manage without modern sewage systems. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and hepatitis spread through contaminated water sources within weeks of infrastructure failure. Mosquitoes breed in standing water from clogged gutters and abandoned swimming pools, transmitting malaria, dengue fever, and West Nile virus to survivors who lack medications or immunity. Rats multiply exponentially in urban ruins, carrying plague and leptospirosis. Without pest control, lice, fleas, and ticks become constant companions, spreading typhus and Lyme disease. The Walking Dead occasionally shows characters getting sick, but treats it as individual bad luck rather than the public health catastrophe it would actually be. In reality, survivors living in close quarters without clean water, soap, or antibiotics would face epidemic-level disease outbreaks that kill more people than zombies ever could. Cargo, an Australian zombie film, touches on this when the protagonist worries about his infant daughter's hygiene and nutrition, but the film doesn't expand on how entire communities would struggle with basic cleanliness. 28 Days Later shows empty hospitals, which means no insulin for diabetics, no blood pressure medication for hypertensive patients, no inhalers for asthmatics. Chronic conditions become death sentences when supply chains break. World War Z montage sequences include overwhelmed medical facilities, but the film quickly moves past this to focus on military response rather than exploring how disease would compound crisis exponentially. The Black Death killed a third of Europe in 4 years without zombies. An apocalypse would trigger multiple plagues simultaneously, and you can't outrun microbes. Now here's the twist. Even if disease doesn't kill you, there's one resource you need that runs out in 72 hours. Not food, something worse. And the way movies ignore this reveals they fundamentally misunderstand human biology. Water scarcity. Municipal water systems fail within days once electricity grids collapse. Pumping stations stop, treatment plants shut down, and pipes lose pressure, leaving taps dry. Rivers and lakes become contaminated with runoff from decaying bodies, industrial chemicals, and untreated sewage. Drinking untreated water causes violent gastrointestinal illness that dehydrates you faster than thirst alone. Boiling water requires fuel, which means gathering wood or scavenging propane, both of which expose you to danger and use time you need for other survival tasks. World War Z shows crowds mobbing water trucks, but the film doesn't explore how quickly those resources vanish or how communities would fight wars over aquifer access. Dawn of the Dead features survivors in a mall with presumably working plumbing fed by municipal systems that should have failed immediately. Zombieland plays this for laughs with Bill Murray's mansion having a pool, but pool water treated with chlorine requires careful filtration before consumption, and the chemicals degrade over time. The Walking Dead shows characters occasionally filling containers from streams without addressing how many people would die from Giardia or Cryptosporidium. 28 Weeks Later shows military-controlled safe zones, which would absolutely prioritize water infrastructure, but the film doesn't depict the massive engineering effort required to purify and distribute water to thousands of refugees. Rainwater collection helps, but requires clean containers and surfaces, both of which become scarce. Digging wells takes weeks of labor with proper tools, and shallow wells pull from water tables potentially contaminated by surface runoff. Survivors need approximately 1 gallon per person per day for drinking alone, more for cooking and hygiene. A group of 10 people needs 70 gallons per week. Every week? Forever. That's 280 pounds of liquid to transport if you're moving locations. Water scarcity kills silently and absolutely, but solving water creates a different problem, and this one explains why every survivor group eventually tears itself apart. It's not zombies. It's not raiders. It's something way more basic, and one movie almost got it right before chickening out with a happy ending. Food preservation. Refrigeration stops when power grids fail, meaning all frozen food thaws and rots within days. Meat, dairy, and produce become biohazards. Canned goods last years but require can openers, and rust compromises seals over time. Dried pasta, rice, and beans remain edible if kept dry, but cooking them requires water and fuel. Looting grocery stores provides short-term relief until shelves empty, which happens within weeks as every survivor in the region has the same idea. After that, you're hunting, gathering, or starving. Zombieland treats Twinkies as the ultimate survival food, playing on their reputation for longevity. But even Twinkies expire, and a diet of pure sugar and preservatives causes is malnutrition. The Walking Dead shows characters growing vegetables in prison gardens, which is realistic, but the show glosses over the months of labor required to prepare soil, plant seeds, and nurture crops to harvest, while defending against walkers. World War Z includes a brief scene of Israeli agriculture within safe zones, acknowledging that sustainable food production matters, but doesn't explore the expertise required for large-scale farming or the vulnerability of crops to disease and pests without modern pesticides. Dawn of the Dead places survivors in a mall with a grocery store, but perishables would spoil immediately, and dry goods wouldn't last 4 people more than a few months. Train to Busan unfolds over hours, so food isn't an issue. But the film's sequel, Peninsula, shows scavengers 4 years later still finding edible supplies, which strains credibility. Hunting requires ammunition, skill, and prey populations that would actually increase without human predation initially, but firearms make noise that attracts zombies, creating a deadly trade-off. Fishing requires water access and equipment. Foraging demands botanical knowledge to avoid poisonous plants. Growing food takes an entire season minimum, and one bad harvest means starvation. Caloric needs don't decrease during apocalypses. They increase from physical exertion and stress. So you'd think food scarcity would unite survivors, right? Wrong, because here's what actually happens when resources run low, and why human nature makes us more dangerous than any shuffling corpse. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is something hiding in plain sight that no movie will acknowledge. Faction warfare. Resources are finite, so groups compete violently for territory, supplies, and control. Armed factions emerge quickly, ranging from democratic communities to warlord dictatorships, and moral lines blur when your children are starving. Trusting strangers becomes lethal because betrayal is easier than sharing, and larger groups have military advantages but require more resources, creating constant tension between growth and sustainability. World War Z shows global governments collapsing into isolated survival nodes, with Israel building walls and North Korea supposedly pulling everyone's teeth to prevent bites, which is horrifying but pragmatic in a twisted way. The film treats military response as heroic, but realistically, soldiers abandon posts to protect their own families when society collapses. 28 Days Later depicts military remnants as rapists and murderers, which is darker but probably more accurate than organized resistance. Dawn of the Dead features biker gangs raiding the mall, representing opportunistic violence, but the film doesn't explore how raiding communities would themselves face internal power struggles. The Walking Dead runs on faction conflict for entire seasons. Communities like Alexandria, Hilltop, and Sanctuary, fighting over food and territory while zombies become background noise. Train to Busan shows class divisions erupting during crisis, with wealthy passengers barricading train cars against infected working-class people, a microcosm of how inequality accelerates during disasters. Cargo focuses on a father's individual journey, avoiding faction politics, but even solo survivors encounter hostile groups that view outsiders as threats or resources. Land of the Dead literally builds a class system where rich humans live in luxury towers while poor humans scavenge in zombie-infested streets, making inequality the actual horror. Groups need leaders, and leaders need enforcers, and enforcers need incentives, which usually means allocating resources unequally, which breeds resentment, which causes fractures. You're more likely to die from a bullet fired by another survivor than from a zombie bite. But let's say you join the right faction and avoid getting shot. You still face something that kills half of all survivors within the first year, and it has nothing to do with violence. In fact, it's so mundane that movies pretend it doesn't exist, and when you realize what it is, you'll understand why zombie films are basically fantasy. Before turning, chronic illness. Pharmacies get looted within days, and medications expire within months to years depending on storage conditions. Diabetics die without insulin, asthmatics suffocate without inhalers. People on blood pressure medication suffer strokes. Cancer patients lose access to chemotherapy. Mental health medications run out, causing withdrawals that mimic psychosis. Antibiotics become worth more than gold, and infections from minor injuries kill because there's no surgery, no sterile environments, no trained medical staff. The Walking Dead kills off characters with chronic conditions quickly and quietly, acknowledging the reality but not exploring it deeply. Herschel loses his leg to amputation after a bite, surviving through luck and basic medical knowledge, but the show doesn't depict how many amputations end in fatal infections without antibiotics. World War Z montages show overwhelmed hospitals, implying medical collapse, but doesn't follow individuals struggling with manageable conditions that become death sentences. 28 Days Later shows empty pharmacies, which means everyone dependent on medication is already dead by the time the protagonist wakes from his coma. Dawn of the Dead includes a pregnant woman, and childbirth without medical support has a maternal mortality rate of 1 in 100 births, plus high infant mortality. The film treats pregnancy as character character development, not the life-threatening medical event it is without hospitals. Cargo makes medication scarcity central to the plot, the father rationing pain relief and racing against time before the infection takes him, which is realistic and devastating. Glasses break, and without optometry, you're navigating by blurry guesswork. Dental problems abscess, causing systemic infections. Minor cuts become septic. Survivors need medical knowledge and supplies that simply won't exist after initial looting. Every person with a manageable chronic condition becomes a ticking clock. Now, healthy survivors think they're safe, but there's one biological function that movies erase completely. It affects half the population, happens monthly, and requires resources that don't exist post-collapse. No film addresses it, ever. And that erasure tells you everything about who's writing these stories. Menstrual hygiene. Periods don't stop during apocalypses, and without access to pads, tampons, or menstrual cups, managing menstruation becomes a daily struggle. Improvising with rags requires water for washing and privacy for changing, both of which are scarce. Unsanitary menstrual management causes infections like toxic shock syndrome. Blood attracts predators and possibly zombies if they hunt by smell. Hormonal birth control that suppresses periods runs out, meaning every woman of reproductive age deals with this every month, and stress delays cycles unpredictably, making planning impossible. No major zombie film addresses this. The Walking Dead has female characters, but never shows them managing periods, as if menstruation vanished along with civilization. World War Z includes women in survival scenarios without acknowledging basic biology. Zombieland features Wichita and Little Rock without ever depicting the logistics they'd face monthly. 28 Days Later has Selena as a capable survivor, but the film ignores menstrual realities entirely. Train to Busan includes a pregnant woman, acknowledging reproductive biology, but not the menstrual management every other woman deals with. This isn't a small oversight. Menstruation affects mood, causes cramping that impacts mobility, and requires supplies that don't exist post-collapse. Women would fashion cloth pads, but those need washing with scarce water and soap, or they become infection vectors. In groups, menstrual synchrony means multiple women menstruating simultaneously, compounding resource needs. Pregnancy risks surge without contraception, and pregnancy during apocalypses is a medical nightmare. Miscarriages happen in 1 in 4 pregnancies even with healthcare, and without support they can be fatal. Films erase this because it's uncomfortable, but ignoring half the population's biology doesn't make it disappear. But biology isn't the only thing that breaks. Something else snaps under apocalypse pressure, and it's invisible until someone in your group suddenly cracks. One movie showed this, then Hollywood buried it because the truth is way darker than zombies. Mental health, trauma, isolation, and constant fear cause PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, and psychotic breaks. Watching loved ones die or turn destroys emotional stability. Survivors' guilt festers. Sleep deprivation from maintaining watch schedules causes hallucinations and impaired judgment. Without therapy or medication, mental health spirals, leading to suicide, violence, or catatonic withdrawal. Communities fracture when members snap under pressure. 28 Days Later shows Jim's disorientation waking to an empty London, capturing early psychological shock, but the film pivots to action rather than sustaining that emotional horror. The Walking Dead depicts Rick's deterioration over seasons, hallucinating Lori and Shane, showing how leadership stress compounds trauma. But the show uses this for drama rather than exploring how entire communities would face collective mental health crises. World War Z includes a scene where a virologist accidentally kills himself, a brief acknowledgement of psychological fragility, but the film doesn't follow survivors dealing with long-term trauma. Cargo centers on a father's grief and desperation, his mental state deteriorating as infection progresses, which rings true emotionally. The Girl with All the Gifts shows a child struggling with her identity as a hybrid human zombie, touching on psychological horror of existence. Warm Bodies attempts to depict zombie consciousness, memories surfacing through undeath, but plays it for romance rather than exploring the existential terror. Survivors would face moral injury from killing former friends, ethical exhaustion from constant life or death decisions, and existential dread from societal collapse. Children raised in apocalypses develop attachment disorders without stable caregivers. Elderly survivors lose purpose when their skills become obsolete. Isolation drives people insane, but groups create social stress that's equally damaging. There's no winning psychologically. Mental collapse is bad enough, but it triggers alongside something physical that movies treat as infinite. Cars, generators, entire escape plans depend on it, and it goes bad in 6 months. Realize what that means. Every vehicle scene in zombie movies is a lie. Fuel degradation. Gasoline degrades within 3 to 6 months. turning gummy and clogging engines. Diesel lasts slightly longer, but still breaks down. Ethanol-blended fuels separate, becoming unusable faster. Without refineries producing fresh fuel, every vehicle becomes a temporary asset with a ticking clock. Survivors can't road trip across the country years into the apocalypse because the gas they siphon from abandoned cars is worthless sludge. World War Z shows abandoned vehicles everywhere, but doesn't explain why survivors in later scenes don't just drive wherever they want. Zombieland features cross-country travel in a Cadillac Escalade, burning through fuel that should no longer be combustible. The Walking Dead has characters using cars for seasons without addressing fuel degradation or the mechanical expertise required to maintain vehicles without parts or tools. 28 Days Later takes place shortly after Outbreak, so fuel is still viable. But the sequel, 28 Weeks Later, set months later, still shows helicopters and military vehicles operating as if supply chains function. Mad Max franchise, while not zombie-focused, accurately depicts fuel scarcity driving entire economies, with gasoline becoming currency, which is what would actually happen. Dawn of the Dead survivors use MAL vehicles briefly, which works for short-term escape, but the film doesn't project forward to when those vehicles become useless metal shells. Train to Busan unfolds over hours, so fuel isn't an issue. Fuel degradation doesn't just affect cars. Generators need gasoline or diesel to provide electricity, and when fuel goes bad, you lose refrigeration, water pumps, and communication equipment. Survivors would shift to bicycles, horses, and foot travel, which limits range and carrying capacity. You can't evacuate quickly, can't transport injured, and can't trade over distances. Mobility collapses, and with it, any hope of large-scale coordination. Fuel is just the start, though. When it runs out, it triggers a cascade failure of every system keeping you alive. And there's one system whose collapse kills faster than anything else. Turns out winter is deadlier than summer, and no one's talking about it. Power grid collapse. Electrical grids require constant human monitoring and fuel inputs to maintain balance between generation and consumption. Without operators, power plants shut down automatically within hours to days. Coal plants run out of fuel. Nuclear plants enter safe shutdown. Hydroelectric dams continue generating, but without distribution networks, the power goes nowhere. Within weeks, every light goes out permanently. Renewable sources like solar or wind require maintenance and battery storage to be useful, and those systems degrade without replacement parts. The Walking Dead shows characters occasionally using generators for short-term power, which is realistic, but the show's communities eventually establish sustainable power sources off-screen without explaining the engineering required. World War Z depicts nighttime scenes with flashlights and darkness, acknowledging grid failure, but doesn't show survivors attempting to restore power because that's boring compared to zombie action. 28 Days Later takes place shortly after collapse, so some emergency lighting still functions on backup batteries, but those drain within days. Dawn of the Dead Mall has power initially, running on backup generators, but the film doesn't address fuel needs to keep generators running or what happens when fuel runs out. Book of Eli, a post-apocalyptic film without zombies, shows a world decades after collapse where people have forgotten electricity, which is where zombie worlds would eventually land. No power means no refrigeration for food or medicine, no electric water pumps, no communication beyond shouting distance, no lighting except fire or scavenged batteries. Survivors would revert to pre-industrial lifestyles, but without the accumulated knowledge and tools those societies developed over centuries. You can't just reinvent metalworking or agriculture through trial and error while fighting zombies. But here's the final twist nobody wants to admit. Even if you survive all of this, there's one certainty that ends every zombie story the same way, and it's not what you think. It's not about the zombies winning, it's about humanity losing something else entirely. Heating fuel. Without natural gas pipelines or electricity, heating homes requires wood, which means chopping trees daily and maintaining fires constantly. Wet wood doesn't burn well, and scavenging dry wood in winter is dangerous. Carbon monoxide from indoor fires kills silently if ventilation is poor, but proper ventilation releases heat, defeating the purpose. Frostbite, hypothermia, and pneumonia kill quickly in unheated buildings. Elderly and children are especially vulnerable. The Walking Dead's winter episodes exist, but characters never seem cold, never struggle for firewood, never face frozen water sources. World War Z montages include snow-covered scenes, but survivors wear inadequate clothing without consequence. 28 Days Later takes place in summer, avoiding the issue. Dawn of the Dead Mall presumably has heating systems that run on natural gas or electricity, but both would fail, leaving survivors freezing in a giant unheated building. The Road shows a father and son pushing a shopping cart through snow, depicting the bleakness accurately, with fire as their only warmth and constant fuel gathering as their main activity. Zombieland travels through seasons, but characters never appear affected by cold, despite wearing light clothing. Cargo is set in Australia, avoiding winter, but even Australian winters require shelter. Heating requires massive caloric intake to maintain body temperature, compounding food scarcity. Wet clothes plus cold equals death, and without laundry facilities, everything stays damp. Survivors would cluster together for warmth, increasing disease transmission. Settlements need chimneys, firewood stores, and insulation, all requiring labor and materials that must be gathered while defending against zombies and rivals. So you survived the zombies, the disease, the cold, the starvation. Congratulations. But survival isn't the win movies pretend it is, because what comes next is something worse than death, and only one film had the guts to show it. Technological regression. Knowledge dies with specialists. Within one generation, nobody remembers how to manufacture antibiotics, refine metal, or engineer infrastructure. Books deteriorate, and even if preserved, technical manuals require base knowledge to interpret. Children raised in apocalypses learn survival skills, but not chemistry, physics, or medicine. Communities become isolated, preventing knowledge exchange. Survivors revert to medieval technology levels at best, more likely to Stone Age capabilities. World War Z book describes humanity slowly rebuilding, but the film ends ambiguously with a stopgap solution rather than depicting long-term reconstruction. The Walking Dead's later seasons show communities farming and crafting, maintaining 19th century tech levels, but skip past the decades of trial and error required to relearn metallurgy or animal husbandry without industrial tools. Dawn of the Dead ends with survivors escaping the mall, but the film doesn't project where they go or how they'd sustain themselves long-term. 28 Days Later concludes with military radio transmissions promising rescue, implying coordinated recovery, but realistically, governments would be gone. Cargo ends with Indigenous Australians surviving using traditional knowledge, suggesting pre-industrial peoples fare better, which tracks logically. Mad Max franchise depicts humanity centuries later as scavengers fighting over pre-collapse relics, which is where zombie worlds would eventually end. You can't maintain modern technology without supply chains, education systems, and stable societies. Once the last person who understands combustion engines dies, that knowledge vanishes unless written down and preserved, and most survivors are too busy not dying to archive technical information. 3 generations later, electricity is myth, and humanity starts over from scratch. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the 7 levels of zombie shelters, click the video on the screen.